Good afternoon. My name is Brian Boyles. I'm Executive Director of Mass Humanities, and I'm so happy to have all of you here today for what I think is an important conversation at a pivotal time in our nation, and also in the way we understand and commemorate and learn from our history as a Commonwealth and as a country. As a bit of housekeeping notes, all of you are automatically on mute, but that does not mean we don't want to hear from you. So please do put your questions into the chat. We're going to talk around 45, 50 minutes, and then we're going to open things up to questions that I will relay from the chat. You can follow us at Mass Humanities on Facebook and Twitter, and also visit our website for more information on this and future talks, and to learn about other events that are going on around Massachusetts. This is a time of questioning and debate over the names etched in public spaces, and in that time, Boston's Faneuil Hall is the subject of a new op-ed by two of our guests today, and call for the renaming of Faneuil Hall. They write, "We call upon the city to engage in an expansive community process to decide two issues in sequence. First, whether or not the hall should be renamed, and second, if so, what name should replace Faneuil?" Today, I really want to hear about what provoked this article and an understanding of our past and our present that's important to all of us, but also what the process would be for doing this renaming, because I think that the co-authors do a lot to point the way forward for this conversation. We're also joined by a scholar who was mentioned in the article and has done fantastic work about the particular era in Boston's history in which Faneuil operated. Martin Blatt is Affiliate Professor of Public History and former Director of the Public History Program at Northeastern. He spent many years working for the National Park Service in Boston and Lowell, served as the president of the National Council on Public History, and in 2020 he received the organization's Robert Kettley Memorial Award. David Harris is the managing director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute at Harvard. He previously served as the founding executive director of the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston, currently chairs Massachusetts Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and in 2018, he received Mass Humanities Governor's Award in the Humanities. And Jared Ross Hardesty, who was added a little later to our bill, but is nonetheless here with us from the state of Washington, is an associate professor of history at Western Washington University and a scholar of colonial America, the Atlantic world, and the histories of labor and slavery. His two books include Unfreedom, Slavery and Dependence in 18th Century Boston, and last year's Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds, which looks at history of slavery in New England. David, we're going to start with you today. I wanted to ask about the origin of this op-ed. It appeared on August 4th. It's co-written by you and Marty. How did the two of you come together? What motivated you, and what was the writing process to put this argument forward?
Brian, you need to unmute me.
I think you're unmuted now, David.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Brian. It's great to be here. I wanted to, I'll get to the question. I wanted to make a couple of small adjustments. One, I am the managing director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. That last part is an important part of our name. Also, I wanted to say that technically our piece did not call for the renaming of Faneuil Hall. Our piece called for a public conversation about whether this should be renamed. And I think it's really important to me that our audience understand that. I might have a particular perspective on this, but the point is that we need to have a public conversation. So to your question, though, it's interesting. I just realized, it was July 22nd last year that Marty and I appeared on, was it WBUR, to talk about the piece of artwork that had been proposed for Faneuil Hall. And as part of that conversation, we also talked about the need to think about, kind of what our buildings are called, and just the general history of the relationship between various buildings and slave past. And it was a lively and informative conversation. And at the time, there was already a move on to rename Faneuil Hall, or to have a discussion about it. And so, I think, then, as other things started to perk up, there's always questions about the Massachusetts flag, and there was this question about the Emancipation statue, and Marty kind of got in touch with me and suggested that maybe we do this. So, in terms of what actually triggered that from Marty, you're going to have to ask him that. But the process of writing itself was actually, interesting and fun, and we had our own conversation. about what to include and how to approach this. So Marty, maybe you could say what triggered it for you in the first place.
I think you're on mute still, Marty.
How about now?
You good?
Okay, good. Well, what motivated me on this goes back several years. When I worked with the National Parks of Boston, I was involved in developing the visitor center, some call it a contact station, on the ground floor at Faneuil Hall, which in the busy summer months when there's not a pandemic, there are hundreds of thousands of people swarming through there. And I had wanted to see some significant treatment of Peter Faniel and his relationship to the slave trade there. And we got, I think, half of one sentence included. And it irritated me at the time. And it's irritated me ever since. That was several years ago. But now, as I've thought more about this over the years, and as I've been stimulated by the events that are unfolding around us, I thought, let me reach out to David. We did this thing last year in the aftermath of the failed public artwork of Steve Locke, which is another complicated story, probably not for today. But let's try to see if we can get a conversation going around, why do we still have this name attached to this historic site?
So I think it's always good in those conversations to start on where did this name come from in the first place? How did this building arrive here? So I did want to turn to Jared at this point. And Jared, can you just, I think, explain for us who Peter Faniel was and how we got to a place where this building was named for him?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, for joining the conversation. Thank you all for coming. It's a great turnout for this event, and I think the topic does spur quite a bit of conversation. So, yeah, who was Peter Faniel? Well, Peter Faniel was born actually in New Rochelle, New York, in 1700. His parents were refugees from France. They were French Protestants called Huguenots. And they fled to New York, New Rochelle. Eventually, they moved to New York City. And so Peter Faniel grew up in New York City. And as a young man, his father became a fairly prominent merchant in New York City, Benjamin Faneuil Sr. But when his father passed away, he actually moved to Boston, where he had an uncle named Andrew Faneuil. And Peter Faniel apprenticed under his uncle. His uncle sent him to London, where he learned to be a merchant. He made all sorts of connections. And when he returned to Boston, he started engaging in commerce in his own right. And, one of the things that if you track, I spent a lot of time since I found out I was going to be part of this event, reading Peter Faniel's ledger books and invoice books and correspondence and things like that. And it's really interesting to see the business network he cultivated, because it was partly the network he cultivated while he was in London, his old New York contacts, but also with his family. This Huguenot diaspora, they go across the Atlantic. And so he has family members in New York and Boston, of course, where he resided, but also London, Dublin, Amsterdam, Paris, Nantes. So he has family all over the place. And this allows him to draw upon these connections. And throughout the 1720s and 30s, he becomes a very, very wealthy merchant. And then when his uncle Andrew, who was famously a bachelor, there's a whole myth around this, we want to talk about myths later, passed away in 1738, Peter Faniel inherited all of his money. And so he's very wealthy. He was certainly the wealthiest man in Boston by 1740, and probably one of the wealthiest men in British America, if not the empire as a whole. So he's a very wealthy merchant. And his commerce sort of spanned two nodes, we could call them, or two areas. The first is the trade with Europe, mainly through London, where he's trading manufactured goods. He's trading cloth, especially things that have to do with cloth. And he's selling them largely in Boston, sometimes re-exporting them. The other side of his business is in the Americas. And this is where we're going to see Peter Faniel's connections with slavery. One of his mainstays of commerce was between Boston and the West Indies, the plantation society of the West Indies, where they grow sugarcane. not just those of the British Empire, so he's trading with Barbados, Antigua, Jamaica, but also extensive connections, unsurprisingly given his background and his linguistic abilities with the French Empire. So he has contacts in Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue, what is today Haiti. And what he's doing is he's largely shipping loads of salt cod and timber from North America to the West Indies. That's being used on plantations to feed enslaved people, to build structures on plantations, things like that. Historians call this the business of slavery. And this was very much the backbone of 18th century Boston's economy. In that sense, Faneuil is not different than most other merchants in Boston, in which slavery ultimately lies at the heart of the commerce. He's trading the salt cod, the timber, for molasses, for sugar, that's being brought back to New England, that's being re-exported across the Atlantic, depending on what product. And so, so he's engaged in this, like I said, this business of slavery, where he's feeding enslaved people with salt cod, and he's consuming slave-produced commodities. Mostly, he's reselling the molasses, for example, in Boston to be made into rum. He's buying West Indian rum to be sold, which is considered to be of a higher quality. So that's his one connection to slavery. The other connection is, and that's perhaps his main connection to slavery for most of his career. His other connection, though, is actual engagement in slave trading. We have three pieces of evidence, possibly a fourth, that notes that Faneuil was part of, was a slave trader. The first is a letter in 1738 where he requests one of his ship captains to purchase him an enslaved boy for his household in Antigua. The second is he actually sent his ship, the Jolly Bachelor, to West Africa to engage in the transatlantic slave trade. This is a tantalizing piece of evidence, because the only reason we know about that is because it ended disastrously. It's actually attacked by pirates. And it raises the question, is if that's the only reason we know about this voyage, were there others? And the third piece of evidence is actually when he passed away, he owned 5 enslaved people. So he's obviously engaged in the slave trade enough to acquire 5 enslaved people for his own household. And there's other evidence as well. There's all sorts of circumstantial evidence. His father was a slave trader. His uncle was a slave trader. His brother-in-law and one of his main business partners, James Boutnow, was a slave trader. So at some point, all these associations add up. So he has direct links to the business of slavery, to slave trading, and then he also, by the end of his career, he's so wealthy, he becomes a major kind of financier. There's no banks in 18th century Boston, and so the wealthiest merchants became the folks who you would get loans from, who would underwrite insurance policies, who would cut checks, and things like that, like essentially function as banks do. And Faneuil underwrote and invested in a lot of business ventures that involve slave trading and this business of slavery. So everywhere he's connected to slavery. And once again, that's not that unusual for an 18th century merchant in Boston, but it's by virtue of his wealth, it's quite considerable just by him, kind of acting in the world. Which leads us to Faneuil Hall, because this is the other side of Peter Faniel. He's famed, and perhaps what he's most known for today was his philanthropy. He was incredibly charitable, and this probably comes out of the fact he's the child of refugees, and especially involved in Episcopal causes. So he's involved in King's Chapel, Old North. He donates all sorts of money there. But he also, in 1740, provides money for a public market and meeting place in Boston. This was a source of controversy. It's an arcane debate. I won't go too far into it. But there was a debate over, do we want a central public marketplace? And one of the sticking points was who's going to pay for it. And a lot of people said the taxpayers of Boston are not going to. So Faneuil, who's in favor of building a central marketplace, offers to kick in a considerable sum, I think it's about 300 pounds sterling, to help build the building. It's approved barely in a very close vote of the town meeting. And construction began in 1740. The hall opens in late 1742, and Peter Faniel actually died in March 1743. So Faneuil Hall was only open for about 6 months in Peter Faniel's lifetime. And this is one of the questions about renaming, is that so much of the history of the hall is actually not associated with, very little of it's actually associated with him. He's dead 6 months, it's unclear how much time he actually spent in the hall, maybe a couple of times when it opened, but he didn't spend much time there. Instead, it's associated with his name. And so yeah, it's a philanthropic endeavor, but also it was a political decision on his behalf, right? This push for a centralized marketplace, and it's funded with the profits of slavery, whether the business of slavery or from slave trading.
So I think that this discussion is important when you mention the business of slave trade and how that is the backbone of Boston, really in the decades prior to the revolution. It seems that some of the challenges we are going through right now is that there is a larger comprehension of just how deep the slave trade reached into the American economy. So as we look at sites that are named after philanthropists or business people, people of a certain time period touched on slavery very actively and accumulated wealth through trade, and that seems to have been surfaced more in recent years in scholarship and now in public understanding as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
As we think about that public understanding, I wanted to turn to you, Marty, because you do have such great experience with the National Park Service. This is now a site that people come to learn Boston's history, and I think you make an interesting argument in the essay around why that makes it just such an important time to get this naming issue on the table. Can you talk a little bit about the building today, who owns it, who operates it? Because again, that plays into who might be overseeing a process to change the name.
Sure. The city of Boston owns the structure. And so in order for this discussion to begin and have some kind of an impact, there's got to be the mayor and or the city council have to get engaged. All right. The National Park Service, in the organization, the National Parks of Boston, has what's called in Park Service parlance a cooperative agreement. It's a formal agreement through which the Park Service manages some of the space. So the Park Service is on the ground floor with that visitor center contact station. In the basement, there's drinking waters and bathrooms on the sweltering days of the summer walking the Freedom Trail. Very important to have those. And also a meeting space where there's films and for small meeting space, and also offices for park rangers. There's the Grand Hall upstairs, where citizens are regularly sworn in, and we might think about, gee, they're sworn in a building named after someone with such a major role in the slave trade. That's something to ponder right there. And then the other occupant of the building is the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company, which has 18th and 19th century weaponry on display on the third floor, I believe it is. So the city owns it. The Park Service has a major presence, and the Park Service to its credit, if you look at its website, if you can't go in there now because of COVID-19, but the Park Service had been moving somewhat in a good direction, that is to enhance interpretation such as what Jared was discussing, the history and the background and the context of Faneuil. There needs to be a lot more done.
So can I ask you a question, Marty, real quick?
Sure.
As I recall, in the hall, the artillery hall, the top floor, was there at one point until fairly recently Confederate Army memorabilia housed there?
That could be. You may have knowledge of that, David. I know that there's all sorts of. It was being, even though I've done all this work on military history, I'm not a military history buff, so I tended not to spend too much time up there. All I can remember is, bayonets, swords, rifles from the 18th and the 19th century. Whether there was Confederate, I don't know.
I think there might have been, and it was removed. But yeah. And can I ask Jared a question?
Sure.
So I mean, it's interesting to me because I think that one thing that's important for us to understand about the history was, first of all, he didn't ask for it to be named after him, right? It was named after him by vote, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
I wish you'd share with me a little bit about who got to vote at that time. Who was voting? Because I know this is particularly relevant for us, and we're going to get back into this. But who cast those votes?
It would have been the town meeting. So these were all free men, all those rated as free men in the town of Boston in 1740. And so this would have been mostly, it would have been white men above the age of 21 who held property. And yeah, there was a property requirement, I think about 25 pounds sterling to vote. It's not a lot, but it's enough to prohibit a lot of people. But yeah, you had to be man, 21. And Massachusetts never did actually put racial, like they never explicitly prohibited, say, people of African descent or indigenous descent from voting, but it was in practice that way in the laws.
I think that's important for us in this conversation, and we'll come back to that. But yeah.
Right. Who's going to participate in this process now?
Mm-hmm.
How is that going to be inclusive? And I think it's interesting to note, if David's correct about there being Confederate material in there at some point, whether or not that was true, because in many ways, the point we've reached to in this country where we're talking about that history has now reached out again to places throughout the North where these kind of questions are happening. I do want to talk about what this conversation could look like if it enters into a process of really, I think, engaging stakeholders. But I did want to pause, Marty, and just say, and this is for all three of you, when you think about the process that you would like to see go forward, are there models for this that you think have worked, either in this country or abroad, when it comes to dealing with this kind of history, whether it's for a landmark or just a difficult conversation that we're looking to have?
Well, I can start and then the others can jump in. I do think that what a public conversation would look like, we have to define. I mean, the city council and the mayor are elected. And so it makes sense for them to help steer that ship of defining what that public process would look like. I did have a conversation in advance of this meeting with Greg Gaylor of the Boston Preservation Alliance. And he pointed out to me that, I think it's a good point, there's a lot, which I think is great, going on right now. So, for example, there are at least two other public history cases that are open, and what's going to happen. So the Emancipation Group, the Boston Art Commission said, is being removed. That's one. That's Lincoln with appearing to bestow liberty on the kneeling slave, right? Which is a copy of something from that the original is in Washington, D.C. So Boston Art Commission has decided to remove that. What will replace it, if anything? That's a question that is not answered now. Similarly, the statue of Christopher Columbus on the Boston waterfront park, has been subject to attack, understandably so, I would say, for many years. Recently, it was beheaded. The statue and the head, which was recovered, are in storage. So what will the city do with that? All right. Now, the city of New York did organize in response to Charlottesville, the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville and the murder of Heather Heyer, a mayoral advisory commission on art, monuments, and markers. And that's one model. There could be a mayoral commission that tries to look at this issue holistically. That is, let's look at, and these are just some examples, there are several others. that would be some of my response to that question. But David, Jared?
Well, I mean, I think those are good examples, Marty. I mean, I'm struck. I'm struck by the fact that we now have Nubian Square in the city of Boston. We have Nubian Square in the city of Boston because of the history of Dudley, for whom Dudley Square was named. And we have that renaming at the end of a process in which which was voted on by the public, right? And the residents of Boston. Now, the renaming did not win, right? Except in the surrounding neighborhoods of Nubian Square. And there was a decision made that voice would be the voice that prevailed. And so the fact is, there are all kinds of models, there are all kinds of ways, if we decide that we have the political will or the pressure is great enough or whatever the wind blows, whatever it is, right? So I think it's, and we have examples here in Boston of our ability to make changes. We have Yawkey Way going down. We have, so there are examples of other places, and other jurisdictions are engaging in questions about reparations and all kinds of things, but from whom we could learn. All right, but and I would challenge one thing, which is that I think the elected officials do need to be involved and engaged in this, but I think there's something about this moment that we need to understand. Those elected officials can convene this conversation, but I don't think they can define it, right? I don't think they can circumscribe it. I think they need to convene it, and we need to think about ways to make sure that the conversation is indeed inclusive and reflects the voices of people throughout the city, as opposed to standard operating procedure, which has to do with certain kinds of, powerful or influential people having greater access. I mean, the ability to facilitate this conversation is a test for us about how much we're listening to the demand and the need to involve and include the voices of people who have been shut out for too long.
And I would just add quickly, in the article, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, David and I talk about a two-step process. One, should this be renamed or not? That's one question, and that's a prior question, if you will. And if the resolution is yes, well, then there's a process, and then we'd have to figure out, as you've indicated, how do we do that and make sure that that process is the inclusiveness is maximized.
I think those lead to my big questions, and I think there's no ideal setting, but I do think there's a question of, well, what are the challenges to doing this, and what would that first meeting or first series of meetings look like? I lived in New Orleans when the conversation ramped up around taking down the Confederate monuments. I held a program much like this several years earlier. Productive conversation based in the humanities. There was a presidential election and everything got radicalized. The monuments finally came down, but it was not a moment that I would call unifying, and not just because there was a division between people who wanted to keep it up and people who wanted to keep it down, but that there have been community organizers and movement people who had wanted to see those come down for quite a long time, who did not feel like they were part of the process when it finally happened. There was also not good caretaking of those monuments in order to have the kind of educational moments that I think you're asking to be etched into Faneuil Hall with exhibitions and other uses of that space, including inclusive practices when it comes to hiring vendors there as well. I say all that to say that we do seem to be in a setting where there is heightened interest in this. We are also in a state where there can be some general agreement about some of these things. But when you look, I really want us to take a moment here to say, okay, if we were to break this out of here and we had some budget to do it, and I take David's point very seriously about not just allowing this to be a politically driven process, what do those first meetings look like from your perspectives? I think each of you really.
Well, let me just back up and to one of the points you just raised about what are some of the challenges? And so here's the challenge, and we can all respond to it. In 2018, so not that long ago, Mayor Marty Walsh, the mayor of the city of Boston, quote, "If we were to change the name of Faneuil Hall today, 30 years from now, no one would know why we did it. Not many people know about the history of that man. We can't erase history, but we can learn from it," end quote. So there's a lot of challenges posed in that, which we might take a moment or two, David or Jared, to because we need to try to help influence some thinking here, or I think this is some misguided thinking that we need to look at. But either one of you want to comment on that?
Go ahead. I mean, I have something, but Jared, go ahead. I mean, do you have thoughts on that?
I'm still thinking. No, go ahead, David.
So you know, my question is, how's that been working out so far? Right. So I took some time today to do a little popular culture search here, and I went to the Faneuil Hall Marketplace website. Right. This is what it says: Boston baked beans, Indian pudding, clam chowder, lobster rolls, oysters on the half shell, all New England delicacies that join a cornucopia of foods from around the world to create a unique dining experience at Faneuil Hall Marketplace. For over 40 years, the Marketplace has been a food destination featuring top restaurants and world-famous colonnade. And it goes on from there. Now, sure, this is talking about the Marketplace in general, but that's what people talk about. That's that you know, people might visit the Park Service exhibits, but Faneuil Hall is this, you know, and then they go on to talk about the acrobats, right? They talk about, you know, you can go see jugglers and all this great entertainment you can see. So the name, you know, people have forgotten. Nobody knows. People don't know now. What's to forget, right? It's been whitewashed, literally. Right? It's not, you know, it's not part of public discourse. I mean, and this idea that somehow miraculously by leaving the name up, we're going to talk about it more or learn its lessons. You know, it's been a couple hundred years now, right?
Yeah.
It's not a persuasive argument.
No, it isn't. And you know, he says 30 years from now, no one would know why we did it. Well, that's the point. In the article, we say, well, you know, let's look, City of Boston, give up some of that lease space. You know, you can sell a little less chocolate and, you know, Freedom Trail tchotchkes, if you know the Yiddish, and you know, replace that with a serious, extensive exhibit that deals with Peter Fanuel's own history and puts him within the context of slavery. We don't want to pick on him too much because he's not isolated, as Jared indicated earlier. I mean, you know, that's the, and then he talks about we can't erase history. Well,
I think we're pretty good at erasing history.
But this country has a great tradition of erasing history, and with respect to Faneuil Hall, you know, I would venture to guess 99% of the people who go to Faneuil Hall now have no clue that this guy was a major player in the slave trade. And that's what a significant piece of what enabled him to gift this to the town. You know, he's talking about erasing history. We are now engaged in a major erasure of history. What we're talking about is let's surface this history. So, but I wanted to raise that quote because we have some work to do. We have some conversation to engage in order to move this issue along to where we can really have the discussion about renaming.
Yeah, it just strikes me we're stuck in some sort of weird limbo, right? Where we're very much erased history, but we still have this name attached that's decontextualized from any of its the action. And so actually, I think we're in a worse situation than either way you go at the moment, because some people want this knowledge, others don't. But we're just kind of stuck in a weird limbo. And the quote, in fact, is actually quite contradictory and illustrates that limbo.
And again, citing the article, I mean, one of the points that Marty and I make is that if there is a decision to change the name, and I always say if that were the outcome, then the fact of that decision should be part of the public record that people see when they go in there. They go in there and they say, this place used to be called Faneuil Hall, but the people of the city of Boston decided that they did not want that name on this building and chose to take it off for all the reasons that you can study and read about here in terms of who Peter Faniel was. So that's how you insert that history into the public consciousness and the public experience.
And I think that we would need to acknowledge that it was the murder of George Floyd and the uprising, the subsequent uprising. That too, that would need to be a part of the public record, part of the interpretation. History is not static; it's dynamic, and in the questions that we ask or we fail to ask, and the evidence we look at and the evidence we set aside, is ideologically driven, and that's true for books and it's true for exhibits.
It would seem that we live in a time that is unique in that when something that is part of systemic tragedies happens, in other words, the murder of George Floyd, people turn now to look at the battleground of history. That to me seems like a unique dynamic that is playing out in our political and social landscapes right now. The conversation we're having, I think, is very much, in some ways, how can making history make history? So how can we actually make change in the history as a result of the changes that are happening that seem to be historic on our streets and in our neighborhoods? And this is, again, another question that I think any of you could tackle, but what do we say to the person who says, well, where does it end? What do we say to the person who understands, if they healthily understand it, that slavery had this very comprehensive impact on this country? That really, there are probably markers attached to slavery that at least count to the number of markers around World War I and World War II. It's public space all over this country is riddled with that history. I think it's important that when we talk about a process, we say that we are trying to do it in a place that is really known as the cradle of liberty. And so we could be setting quite a great example here for how this could be done in many places, large and small, in terms of importance or scale. But that is a question that keeps coming back. Well, how far will we go and to what end? It's a broad question, but I do think it's one that we take into account healthily if we want to actually make this an inclusive conversation as much as we possibly can for people in Boston or people around the state.
Who wants to, David? Did you...
You start, Marty.
Okay. Well, I imagine what you're talking about is Washington or Jefferson, so that right. And is that what you're getting at, Brian?
We had recently, social media featured a graphic that had almost all of the sign. There's a declaration, everyone but Adams was crossed out as a slave owner. So if we are going to go about this kind of reckoning, there's a certain end of the spectrum that says, well, what is still sacred? What is protected? What doesn't come down?
Well, I don't think it's I'll make a few reactions and the others have jumped in. It's not a matter of sacred or to point out, many presidents were either slave owners or openly racist. Right down. I mean, Trump is not exceptional in that regard, right? There's a long history of this. So I think with respect to Washington and Jefferson, you know, the Washington Monument might be pretty hard to take down. It's quite a footprint, I would imagine. But I do think that we need to understand the American history. And so, for example, University of Virginia in Charlottesville, which, you know, Jefferson, you know, helps to create, right? They've now, I just read a piece in the New York Times, they've now dedicated a piece of public art which has the names of the enslaved who helped, I believe, to build it and work there. You know, and so that's adding something to what has for a long time been seen as a shrine to Jefferson, right? But let me get Jared and David to jump in. There's a lot of different ways to look at this.
Yeah, do you mind, David, if I jump in?
No, go ahead. No, watch it.
Okay. Yeah. So you know, and this isn't, you know, that question, I can't help but see it sometimes asking bad faith, you know, how far will this go? Because we're not even acknowledging the full past now. And so we can't ask how far it's going to go if we're not even, you know, starting, you know, we can't even acknowledge Faneuil as a slave trader, let alone, you know, we're not even talking about renaming the hall yet. And so how far does this go? I think Marty's right, where you can do both. You can, you know, have a recognition that Jefferson started the University of Virginia, but you can also recognize the enslaved people that worked there and that labored there, that he owned. And so if we can do both, I think there's space for that sort of complexity in these public conversations. But it's up to historians to be able to, you know, and other stakeholders to figure out how do we convey that. But yeah, I can't help but think, you know, this is a slippery slope. I don't know if the slope hasn't started yet, so I'm not sure where, you know, if we haven't, you know, we haven't gone that far yet.
So, Brian, you know, I mean, I think each of us is going to have to wrestle with this, and we'll have to wrestle with it publicly. But I have this idea that justice means being made whole. That's what justice means. And to the extent, part of what we're talking about here has to do with justice, right? How do we make ourselves whole and make those who have been enslaved whole? How do we do that? And I don't know that there is a fixed answer. I don't know that there is a date certain. I don't know that there are people who are eligible or ineligible. I do know they took Woodrow Wilson's name off a school at Princeton, didn't they? Mm-hmm. Right? He's a president. They took his name off for less things than some of our other presidents had done, I might add. And, you know, and I think we need to be able to create and maintain a sense of proportion. There's this old saying about the proper tool for the proper job. And I think, you know, there's also a saying in different parts of the law, well, if I do it for this person, I have to do it for that person. Well, if the circumstances are the same or similar, then maybe you do, but you need to take each case. And I don't think you can have, and the last thing I'll say is, if we're revisiting history, and, you know, Marty mentioned George Floyd, and, you know, he and I were talking earlier, I think we have to also mention Ahmaud Arbery, right? Because much as we think this history, as Faulkner, this history isn't even dead. That was a lynching, and I don't use the word loosely. It was a lynching that was ignored by public officials for weeks. So the question, you know, slavery, you know, and you know, kind of this reckoning it lives on. It's not in the past. You know, look, in the city of Boston, we know, as the Boston Globe said, it's not a typo. White family income, median income, family income in the city of Boston is $247,500. For a black family, it's $8. $247,500 to $8. Now, that's not all the result of slavery, but it is all the result of a system that was built up on the same dynamics of racism and privilege that allowed slavery to persist as it did. So this is a conversation, you know, I don't think we can run away from this. We can't pretend that we know where the end is until we get on the road. We got to get on the road, people.
Thank you. I hear you. Those things that we have seen day in and day out date all the way back to Faneuil Hall. They date all the way back to Peter Faniel. And the making whole is going to need to be more comprehensive and complicated than any single solution or dateline is going to be able to provide. We have some good questions along those lines when it comes to how we go about this. Gloria asks, should individuals throughout the Commonwealth be included in these conversations, or should it be specific to the people of Boston? Someone else asks, how could we include Boston school children? Again, these are brass tacks here, but thoughts on questions like that about how to get on the road.
Well, that's a great question about who should be part of this conversation. I will admit to you that, you know, I live in West Medford, you know, I'd like to be part of this conversation. So, but, you know, I think, you know, that's a difficult one. And I think it's something we would have to consider. But I'll also say that, you know, as we mentioned in our article, this guy named Kevin Peterson, you know, kind of started doing this work some time ago, and he went and he shared this question with school-age children in Boston, right? Kind of told them a little bit about the history. And I don't know if he's on a call, he can put in a link to where the video is of the results of that. But I do think that involving the children is really important, and it's, you know, and their voices are, you know, and you know, are important. But it's exactly engaging in that question, you know, kind of, should it be the whole Commonwealth? Should it be just Boston? How do we decide? You know, Marty and I aren't pretending that we have the answers to that, but we do insist that we have to address all of these questions somehow, collectively.
I have a note here from Joe Begley, who is the City Archaeology Program City Archaeologist in Boston, who said he's leading a Boston Community Preservation Commission funded project to create a new permanent exhibit at Faneuil Hall, which will specifically focus on Boston's role in the slave trade. It's planned to start March of this year, but will be starting, obviously delayed by the pandemic, with the hope that they will launch in early 2022.
And I think that Jared might have something to say, because I think he was working on that project. Am I right, Jared?
I was, but no longer associated with it.
Okay.
Yeah, no longer. Yeah, it's a long story, but it's fine. But no, I'm not. I was aware of the project though.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
That's welcome news, right? I mean, you know.
Yeah.
Someone, is there, and this is probably a question for Jared, and I'm guessing you have the answer, is there enough of Faneuil's account books available to quantify the extent that slave trading factored into his wealth?
Kinda. This is one of the frustrating things, and it's just part of, you know, studying the 18th century. For as wealthy as he was, as prominent as he was, his account books are really fragmented. So we have fragments from the 1720s, fragments from the 1730s, letter books that go up just about to the time he dies, but once again fragmented. So for example, he has an invoice book or an account book where he records invoices, but we don't have the actual invoices, so we don't know what he was buying and selling. There is material that you can see. So, for example, the 1738 letter where he requests the enslaved boy. You can look at his estate records and see the 5 enslaved people. We have the Admiralty Court records of the Jolly Bachelor. So this is where we have concrete evidence. There's allegedly a record, I couldn't find it, that a historian wrote about of him trading enslaved people to Cape Breton. I'm kind of hunting in a letter, and I can't track the letter down. So the actual direct evidence is hard to find because of the kind of state of the records. But when you start looking at associations and you kind of put it in the context of 18th century Boston, it's much larger than those 3 incidents. It's pretty clear.
I think you may have answered this earlier, Jared, but was property owning essential for voting in Boston? Rose says she thought Winthrop extended voting to all male church members.
Not after 1692 with the new charter.
With the new charter, yeah.
Yeah.
We then have, several ideas around what a name would be. I don't know if anyone has one in mind. I think what's most important here is that we do have a community-driven process that lands at one, but I would open it up just to ask if there's one that's come to mind for anyone.
Brian, are you saying there's some in the chat?
Someone suggested Sam Adams Hall and the Cradle of Liberty. I think those are the two I'm seeing right now.
Well, we made suggestions, preliminary ideas, and which included Frederick Douglass, Lewis Hayden, David Walker, or Crispus Attucks. And we don't have time now, but if these names are obscure to any of you, that's great. Then look them up or get in touch with us offline, and that's why it was part of the discussion. We also said that you could take a name that was more thematic and wasn't tied to an individual. So Philadelphia, for example, has Independence Hall. We could have Freedom Hall or Abolition Hall to honor much of what, but not all, but much of what transpired there in terms of public meetings and discourse.
Or as the questioner suggests, the Cradle of Liberty. I mean, it is known. It is popularly known by that name. It's so again, these are if we get to that, we're at the fun part, right?
Yeah.
But I think people. I mean, I'm glad to hear that the listeners are thinking about it. That's what, Can we imagine and name a new and a different present and future? And that's.
I'm going to ask one more and allow you all to just give any closing thoughts you have. This is from Jean-Luc Piert, who's the president of the North American Indian Center of Boston and a member of the Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana. What was the impact of the Boston Indian Imprisonment Act, which was only repealed in 2005, on slavery contemporary to Faneuil's time? Thinking this is a question for Jared or Marty.
So Indian enslavement in Boston, it was fairly common in the 17th century, but it does disappear. It's actually made illegal by about 1700. It's made illegal, but it doesn't preclude things like debt peonage, and so you do still see people like local indigenous people being held in various sorts of peonage and indentured servitude and things like that. But you also have, in the early 18th century, a sizable slave trade in indigenous slaves from the Carolinas, especially being sold out from the Carolinas up to Boston, and so you can see them in like runaway ads and account books and things like that. There is by about 17. It's in New England as a whole. It's the primary non-white bound labor system before 1700. After 1700, it's African slavery, and then after 1700, it still exists, but in a much smaller form, and certainly supplemental to African slavery.
And I think that in that exhibit, which we hope to see, renaming or not, as I said earlier, let's clear out some space and really have a thorough examination of slavery, which would include 17th century treatment of King Philip's War, which I venture to guess it is something that is not unknown, but little known to most local folks and virtually unknown to anyone visiting. But it should be known, and it certainly does involve brutal treatment of Native Americans and results in enslavement of many. And that's a history that, in terms of its relationship to the history of slavery in colonial New England, should be have a place have a role in that new exhibit on the ground floor at Faneuil Hall.
And it's a history that's memorialized in our flag.
Mm-hmm. Just to clarify what Marty said, that about 2,000 captives from King Philip's War were sold into slavery by the Commonwealth itself to actually help cover the cost of the conflict by the colony.
I think that more and more questions are going to come in for days and days after this. I do want to just pause here as we hopefully get on the road, as David said, and ask for any closing thoughts from each of you before we wrap things up today. Marty, you want to start?
Sure. Okay. Well, just to say that I think that, in my view, that there have been three recent moments or flashpoints in the United States that have stimulated this a broad critical examination of history and public history. One, the mass killing at the Emmanuel AME Church in 2015 in Charleston, South Carolina. Two was the white supremacist neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, I referenced earlier, which resulted in the murder of Heather Heyer, a counter-protester to the neo-Nazis, and then the murder of George Floyd in this year we are in now, this tumultuous year of 2020. And I think that we should, these are all horrific recent developments, but they have sparked, with many, not all, an interest and openness to think about the past differently, and I think also to relate the past to today's crises, and that's the job of us as historians and public historians, and we have, at least three major crises, right? The health, the white supremacy or the racism, and the economic crisis. So we have a lot to do.
I guess my final thoughts is an appeal, and kind of, this conversation, as Marty just alluded to, about Faneuil Hall specifically, has been going on for 5 years, if not long, probably much longer. I've been aware of it for about 4, 5, 6 years. And I guess my appeal is that we have to tell the story. The name change, it could come, it could go. That's a public conversation, but to tell the story of who Peter Faniel was, where the wealth came from. That has to be front and center to all visitors to the hall, whether that's a public art display, whether that's a historic exhibit, or both, preferably. But that my final comments and appeal, this is absolutely, I think, fundamental to the future of Faneuil Hall, is to tell this whole story.
So I'm gonna go way back here, and I'm going to say that last year we all, to some degree, observed or recognized 1619 as 400 years since the first captured Africans landed on the shores of the of the British colonies. And that it's recorded in history as sometime in August, 20 or odd, Africans arrived. On July 30th, weeks before that, it is also recorded on a very specific date, the first convening, and Jared, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the first, the convening of the first elected General Assembly on these shores, right?
Mm-hmm. House of Burgesses, yes.
Yes, and I think, as far as I'm concerned, it's all downhill from there. Because in terms of narratives, when it comes to that convening, and that's why I asked you the question about voting, that convening included, that election included white property Christian men. It excluded Native peoples, it excluded women. Black folks weren't here yet, but it set a tone for the way history is recorded in this country. And that history is repeated in our constitutional proclamation that we, the people, are doing something. And in the documents that follow that We the People, it continued this process of exclusion. And I think if we are in fact going to reckon, we have to reckon with a political history, a social history, an economic history that is based on exclusion and privileging certain perspectives and certain people. And Peter Faniel is one of them. And I think we can start to think about how we address these larger issues by digging into this one, right? And with that, I just want to thank you, Brian, and Mass Humanities for hosting this conversation. It's been great, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thank you.
If we were in front of all of these folks on the call, I would ask them for a round of applause. Martin Blatt, David Harris, and Jared Hardesty. Thank you all for being such strong voices and public humanists who actually want to go out there and tackle these issues. We appreciate it, and we want to do everything we can to support conversations like this. We will be having a conversation next Wednesday, August 18th, with Stuart Rockoff, who's my colleague as the director of the Mississippi Humanities Council, who will be talking about the change they made to their state flag, as well as other work that they are doing down there. You can continue to follow us at masshumanities.org, and as well as on social media. Sign up for our newsletter. If you RSVP'd for today's event, I will be emailing you with a link with the YouTube video of this entire conversation, which we hope you will share. Please continue to support the humanities all around Massachusetts, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you all.